call to order the November 10th, 2020 meeting of the Planning Commission Working Group. Ms. Cook, if you're there, would you call the roll? I'm sorry, it's November 9th meeting of the Planning Commission Working Group.
Excuse me.
Ellen? Can you hear me, Alex?
Yes, I can
hear you, Rich.
Okay, all right. Well, I will go ahead and call the roll then. Mr. O'Connor.
Present.
Mr. O'Connor is an at-large member. Ms. Leverance.
Here.
Ms. Leverance is an at-large member. Mr. Haldeman.
Here.
Mr. Haldeman represents the Berkeley District. Mr. Polster.
Here.
Mr. Polster represents the Jamestown District. Excuse me. Dr. Rose.
Here.
Dr. Rose represents the Roberts District. Ms. Knoll.
Present.
Ms. Knoll represents the Stonehouse District. I represent the Powhatan District, and I am here. Ms. Wertman.
Here.
Ms. Wertman represents the Community Participation Team. Thank you all very much and welcome. Just a reminder that we do have the raise the hand icon on the participant list. So if anyone cares to contribute, please do so. And there was also a resolution in your packets to allow us to conduct this meeting virtually. And to summarize, on September the 8th, 2020, the board readopted the continuity of government ordinance, which under certain circumstances permits this committee to conduct today's meeting by electronic or telephonic means without a quorum of members physically present. May I have a motion for adoption of the resolution for this afternoon's meeting?
So moved, Barbara.
Thank you, Barbara. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Okay, thank you. Although we don't have a dedicated public comment period for these meetings, the public is invited to submit comments either electronically or by voice mail or surface mail. Can I ask Alex, do you know whether we received any comments from the public?
I do not think we have.
Okay.
No.
All right, thank you.
And this is Ellen. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
We can.
Oh, good. Oh, thank goodness. Sorry about that.
we thought you had wandered off.
No, it wasn't a muting issue either. I'm not sure. Reception, maybe. So apologies, but no, we did not receive any public comments.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. And next on the agenda is Planning Commission Working Group meeting minutes from September 28th. Were there any corrections or changes to those meetings, to those minutes? If not,
Moves to approve.
thank you, Jack. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, thank you. Minutes are adopted. I'll now turn it over to Ellen to get the staff presentations and the consultant presentations rolling.
Thank you. Yes, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to the transportation team, and Tori Haynes will lead it off.
Thank you, Ellen, and everyone. Hello, and thank you all for being here. My name is Tori Haynes, Senior Planner for Community Development, and I will be filling in for Tom Leininger to present the transportation section. We also have our consultants, we have our consultants and Keith Nichols from HRTPO here as well to help answer any questions. In this meeting, we will go, next slide. In this meeting, we will go over some of the highlights in the chapter text, the community guidance based on community input received to date, highlight of the UDAs in the county, as well as a brief look at the GSAs from the 2035 Comprehensive Plan. The consultants will also provide an update to the transportation or to the travel demand model. Next slide. In June 2020, Keith Nichols and his team at the HRTPO finalized the historic triangle transportation study for James City County, City of Williamsburg, and York County. The purpose of the study was to look at key issues related to transportation and to assist the localities with the transportation sections of their respective comprehensive plan update. This study helped staff prepare for the comprehensive plan update and also help meet VDOT requirements. Next slide. Based on citizen input and overall trend in transportation networks, staff is putting more emphasis on setting the groundwork to create a more connected network. A multimodal transportation network would accommodate additional transportation choices for the user. This network would allow youth, the elderly, people with disabilities, and those without automobiles to reach different areas of the county. A major component, multimodal corridors, are complete streets. This type of design encourages pedestrian and bicycle use, increases safety, and can ease congestion. Complete streets can also be great public places that encourage people to linger on foot, meet with neighbors, and engage in public life. Next slide. A multimodal transportation network can be done in various ways. One way to reconfigure a roadway without spending money on a full roadway construction project is to do a road diet. A 2018 study done by the HRTPO identified 2 roadway segments in the county that could be good candidates for a road diet. The first is Merrimack Trail from the border of James City County and York to the border of James City County and Newport News. The second segment is Pocahontas Trail from Fort Magruder Hotel to Route 199. Further analysis would need to be done to verify the feasibility of a road diet. Next slide. The surrounding communities have a great impact on the county's roadway network. The Historic Triangle Comprehensive Transportation Study provides data illustrating commuting patterns between localities in the period between 2009 and 2013. Between that time frame, Newport News, York County, and Williamsburg were the top destinations for JCC residents to commute to outside of the county, and also the top 3 localities where people commuted from. Next slide. In order to create a multimodal network, the county will need to actively pursue transportation funding. In some cases, multiple funding sources are needed to create a more competitive application. Not all roadway projects are eligible for each funding source. It depends on the proposal as well as the amount of funding being pursued. Next slide. Around the state and around the country, streets are increasingly being considered as more than just pipelines to move cars. They are being redesigned as multimodal corridors that carry people in a variety of travel modes, including cars, trucks, buses, bicycles, and pedestrians. Multimodal streets ultimately have a capacity to move more than streets that only serve cars. Next slide. In July of 2017, the HRTPO adopted the new Birthplace of America trail route. This trail will connect the Virginia Capitol Trail to Fort Monroe, as well as an additional South Side recommendation to connect to the city of Norfolk. Each locality is still able to make minor adjustments to the route in order to find a more desirable location or to utilize existing infrastructure. Next slide. Staff will continue to pursue funding for transportation projects, but to assist with this, expanding our multimodal network and address development impacts, the zoning ordinance was updated in 2018 to require by right development, including expansions, to add or update pedestrian and bicycle accommodations when certain criteria are met. The ordinance requires the installation of the facility specified on the adopted pedestrian master plan and the regional bikeways master plan, and must be built to VDOT standards. Next slide. WADA has 12 routes meeting various community needs, such as commuter, recreational, and tourism travel, by providing a coordinated system through fixed routes. WADA currently operates under a transit development plan that was adopted in 2016. In addition to passenger fares, WADA is funded by federal and state grants and contributions made by James City County, the City of Williamsburg, and York County. James City County should continue to encourage the expansion of future transit by encouraging compact mixed-use development that is conducive to transit. Next slide. Another important part of the transportation system in James City County is the Jamestown Scotland Ferry on the James River. In July 2020, the Jamestown Scotland Ferry facility received $4.9 million through the U.S. Department of Transportation's Federal Transit Administration Passenger Ferry Grant Program to help improve passenger safety and modernize the ferry slips in Surrey County and Jamestown. The comprehensive plan supports continued 24-hour operation of this critical service. Next slide. The 2019 Citizen Survey resulted in a higher percentage of citizens rating the county's roads and highways as very satisfied or somewhat satisfied. In 2014, that percentage was 59%. 77% of respondents rated bike lanes and sidewalks as very important or somewhat important, which is a decrease from 81% in 2014. Bike and pedestrian accommodations had a satisfaction gap of 6.1%. Roads and highways have a much greater gap at 24.3%. Next slide. Open-ended responses to the citizen survey indicated that while many found the location of the county convenient, there are also many commonly desired changes involving transportation, including improved roads, bike, walking trails, improved congestion, public transportation, and more sidewalks. Many respondents suggested adding more bike lanes, trails, and sidewalks throughout the county, especially in more rural areas. Next slide. During the polling portion of the summit, and online polling that continued weeks after, about 88% of respondents said it was very important or somewhat important for the county to supplement VDOT programs to improve roads and highways. Citizens also provided suggestions on areas where they would like to see improvement, such as Route 60 and Monticello Avenue. Participants were also provided an opportunity to share their big ideas. Many big ideas included support for additional bicycle and pedestrian paths and connecting the places people wanted to go, with some example responses being expand connected network of bike paths and connect neighborhoods with new businesses so workers can bike or walk to work. Other big ideas focused on increased public transit funding, including new bus lines, rail, and connection to other transportation modes, including airports. Next slide. UDAs are areas designated by localities that are appropriate for higher density due to its proximity to transportation facilities, the available of a public or community water and sewer system, or a developed area. Some areas can be used for redevelopment or infill if feasible. James City County has 11 UDAs with various characteristics. Each UDA has a V-Trans 2025 Transportation Needs Assessment that identifies location, socioeconomic characteristics, the current and planned place type, and gaps in the transportation system. James City County should actively continue to submit smart-scale applications during each funding cycle to compete for transportation funding opportunities. These applications should address needs identified by V-Trans for corridors of statewide significance, regional networks, and UDAs. Next slide. For this initial review, staff has not revised the GSAs that were adopted for the current comp plan. Members of the PCWG are welcome to provide initial suggestions and comments regarding the revision of the GSAs, as well as suggestions for questions to include in the next round of public input. Next slide. Only a limited number of questions can be included in questionnaires, and staff seeks any PCWG feedback on what 2 or 3 key questions might be, either from the list shown or based on the recent PCWG review of the attached documents. And now I will turn it over to the consultants to talk about the transportation modeling overview.
So as a part of this comprehensive plan update, we've been using a travel demand model in conjunction with a land use model. And if you recall, in looking at the diagram, we use the land use model to develop currently 2 land use plans, one named the trend plan, which really just allows housing and employment trends currently observed to come to fruition, and then an alternative scenario. So the flow of information goes from the land use model to the travel demand model. The travel demand model then uses the land use plans developed with a common existing plus committed transportation network to yield demand estimates. And as you can see from the diagram, some of that information goes out to other models that are used in the update, including the fiscal model. And then just a few months ago, if you'll recall, we used the travel demand model output to populate transportation indicators, indicating the relative performance of the land use plans with the existing plus committed network for comparative purposes between the land use alternatives. Next slide, please. So one of the products or deliverables from the comprehensive plan update is a transportation model that is based on the HRTPO regional model, something that county staff can use and modify, land use and transportation system assumptions, and that includes roadways and bus routes, in order to get revised travel demand estimates. And I suppose it's the hope of the county to integrate this tool into their planning activities, so they have a little more flexibility and a bit more, decision-making power in their hands to feed their transportation planning process. So, the model that I'm speaking about has been used to get regional data for the trend scenario, the alternative scenario. And as I mentioned before, we use the existing plus committed network as a common element in comparing the performance of the land use scenarios. Next slide, please. So with any travel demand modeling process, and specifically with respect to the process I just described with our different scenarios, we take the travel demand model and we make certain adjustments after running the model with assumptions about a base year, and that is a year where we have observed transportation behavior. So we assume the land use, in this case, it's year 2017, and we also assume a transportation system. In 2017, we run that model and we look at the outputs and compare those outputs to certain things like traffic counts. We want to be sure that the travel model is replicating observed travel behavior. And then we use that model to develop forecasts into the future by updating the land use and transportation system assumptions. And in the case of the comprehensive plan update, we've already run the trend scenario and the alternative scenario, and then there will be a final adopted future land use that we will use the travel model to produce demand estimates. And again, for each of these, we evaluate the results for reasonableness and performance. Next slide, please. And if you'll remember, these are some of the performance indicators that we showed to you a couple of months ago graphically and in tabular fashion, and they address, certain areas of the planning process that are important to the county. And some of the individual measures include how well the demand matches up with capacity. What are the consequences for automobile emissions? What are the changes in travel times and congestion on roadways? And what access does the traveling public have to, for instance, high density employment areas, and also change in transit ridership? So these are the kinds of things that a travel demand model can provide within the context of a planning exercise. And we will be updating these when we run the final land use scenario. Next slide, please. So what we're calling the leave behind travel model, as I stated before, it's going to be based on the features of the regional model. That's what we're scoped to do. It's going to have a smaller geographic footprint. So in other words, it's not going to operate on the entire region, but will be focused on a geographic area around James City County. This offers a couple of advantages, including smaller data requirements and quicker execution times on part of the travel model. But unlike the regional model, this model has a more refined and detailed roadway network representation. We've worked with the county to get to that point so far. And there is also a complete revalidation of base year conditions, focusing on the performance of the model in York, Williamsburg, and James City counties. The aggregate population and employment values are based on the HRPDC forecast for 2045, but as I mentioned, the land use scenarios were crafted based on the needs perceived by this plan update. Next slide, please. So just, as a check on what this travel model really does, and you folks that are planners, there's something that's typically called the 4-step planning process, and it kind of answers the questions that you see in the diagram in the order that you see things proceeding from the top to the bottom. So trip generation, how many trips are generated and what kind, and that's based on different housing types and employment types, household sizes, income levels. And then once we know how many trips are generated, then we want to find out where are they going from point A to B in the region or in the study area for our case. And that's a function of travel costs and also a function of how many trips in any given area are being generated. So there's a magnitude of trips dimension to that and a distance or cost dimension to that. And then once we know the travel patterns, then there's the selection of mode. So if someone wants to go from A to B, are they going to choose the bus? Are they going to choose the carpool? Are they going to choose to drive alone? And then finally, once those choices are determined, then folks need to determine what actual routes they're taking, making use of the roadway network or the bus network to determine how they're going to get from A to B. And so those are your 4 steps. That's basically what a travel demand model addresses. Next slide, please. And so there are many applications a travel demand model, if maintained and cared for properly, in-house can provide. So it's everything from informing a comprehensive plan update like we're doing, or it could be corridor studies, multimodal corridor studies to determine what changes need to be made in certain corridors for certain outcomes. reducing highway travel, for instance. That would be one use of the travel model. Traffic impact analysis. What happens when you assume certain developments on sites that are undeveloped? A travel demand model can serve as one of the ingredients that goes into that type of a study. And of course, transit service planning. Travel demand model can help you determine if to encourage transit use, you need to expand the area of service, or do you need to increase the frequency of service? These are all questions that can be answered in part with the help of a network-based transportation demand model. And I believe I will hand it over to, I believe that's my last slide.
All right,
And
thank
so,
you.
Yeah.
Are there any questions or comments from the working group members on what you've just heard so far? Yes, Frank. You're muted, Frank.
I appreciate Bill's travel demand model piece and the clarifications on that. But one of the things that I'm concerned about in the model that I want it to tell us, and one of the reasons why I didn't quite understand that the alternatives to the traffic were based on moving populations to at least 3 areas: the Croker interchange, which is a USDA, the Anderson corner, and then the expansion of Eastern State. And so when you move those populations in there, you came up with whatever your suggestions were. And the same thing for development along Centerville with the high density pieces. What happens if, as we get to the final or the discussions on the land use map, is we say, we don't want to do those? And so what is your model going to tell us if we say that? One part of it or all of it? So when I asked earlier in the year, I want to finish, please, is I said you double the TAZ population for Eastern State. Your 217 and 215 VDOT shows congested on at least 4 different points, as well as you're going to increase it on the Long Hill 199, and you couldn't tell me what the impact was in your model. And I think we need to know that, as well as Croker and Anderson.
So by impact, do you mean the change in the volume to capacity ratio?
I don't care if you call it the level of service or you call it your congestion, but there are going to be impacts in those areas with the changes of those populations. So the corollary to what Jack was talking about, the law of induced demand, is we're increasing population. What do you expect for that TAZ model to tell you but increase traffic trips? So if you don't do those things, you don't add to it.
So your question is?
What's the impact on Eastern State, Croker, and on Anderson Corner if you don't do those?
We can provide that.
That would be helpful.
And I think we are anticipating that there will be another run of the model that reflects the analysis that you all have done on the different land use areas, or the different potential land use designation change areas.
So that'll be forthcoming then, Ellen, is that correct?
Yes, yeah. Yep.
Okay. Mr. O'Connor.
Just for my own edification, and I apologize for the yappy dog. Isn't part of this discussion to Mr. Polster's question Isn't this sort of to help us identify these UDAs, talk about multimodal, because those are two parts of the equation to then be able to understand the impact on the greater traffic piece? Or am I totally missing the boat here?
I'm sorry, Mr. O'Connor, would you mind repeating your question again?
Sure. I just, Frank's asking the question about if we were to develop these areas that have been identified as UDAs, being Croker, Anderson's Corner, and the like. But isn't part of the discussion, Frank's question is, if we develop them, what's the impact on transportation? But I'm working under the premise that we're having these discussions to continue to identify these UDAs, talk about what multimodal transportation looks like, which then would be able to give us that level of service or the impacts on transportation. Or, I mean, that's just sort of the framework that I was coming from, or did I just, or am I missing the boat on that one? So it's a clarification for me, and I think it's probably, I'm guessing that Vlad's the best one to answer that question.
Well, I guess I could jump in and just say I think you're not missing the boat as far as us all hoping to relook at multimodal approaches and to relook at what the needs are for the UDAs. I think there may be more limited ability for the models to take into account like pedestrian or bicycle modes as far as the impact, but that I would like to turn it over to our consultants to weigh in on.
Right. So if we are looking at UDAs, and just for definitions we all know, so if we're looking at UDAs as being quote unquote mixed use, so that there is work, live, and play type environments, that would have a significant impact on transportation, because people would not need to travel as far to go get what they're looking for, whether it's work or shopping.
So if you increase the density of activity in certain areas, so this is for those of you that this means something, this is a zone-based travel model that really what it does is provides demand estimates for travel between the traffic analysis zones that the travel model has. And so if we're increasing the density of activity, while the travel model doesn't explicitly account for pedestrian and bicycle traffic, the model will react in that it will reduce the amount of demand that can escape any given zone and be assigned to, let's say, the roadway network or the bus network. And that is effectively, for the model, the way it's structured right now, a proxy for reacting or for portraying an increase in demand for pedestrian and bicycle traffic by densification of development. So that's, as I said, the model we're working with is based on the regional model, and the regional model has no explicit provision for pedestrian or bicycle travel. But in the manner I just spoke about, that's the proxy, or that would be how that behavior would be interpreted.
This is Rich Kropp. I'm having a little difficulty with the model from the standpoint, if the assumption is that a UDA is going to be mixed use, that'll have work and play and residential components to it. And so therefore, because work is there, there might be less demand on the roadways. But isn't that a huge assumption? I mean, what's to say that a UDA that develops attracts people for other reasons, maybe the recreational amenities, but they still work outside of the area, or the jobs that are created don't go to the people who live within the UDA, they still go to people outside of the UDA. And isn't that, isn't that a sort of a faulty assumption to say that UDAs will help reduce travel demand? Or am I? Go ahead.
It may well do. The travel model is going to be sensitive to folks that live outside the UDA and how much employment they see inside of it, and vice versa. But there is the potential for more demand being contained within that smaller area. Okay. I don't think I said one way or the other. I did say, though, that the model would be sensitive to such changes. It just depends on the situation, and we'd have to look at what the changes are.
Okay, and then I assume that if the model was left behind, then the parameters could be changed locally based on how things are actually based on real life occurrences. Then.
Absolutely, and that's one of the big utilities of having a tool in-house like that, is that you can modify the inputs and look at the reaction and have those reactions inform your planning activities.
Okay, thank you. Other questions or comments?
Rich,
could I just follow up on that? Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Frank.
I want to go back to what Tim was saying and what you just said, Rich, and that's about the UDAs. And what's being suggested in the staff memo is that we go out and talk to the community about expanding the UDAs, specifically the idea of Eastern State. The other one that's implicit in that is Anderson Corner. And when I say Anderson Corner, if you go back to the 2035 comp plan, and you look at that EO area, which is part of what their future land use plan includes, it specifically says in that comp plan that they don't recommend mixed use. Mm-hmm. And so I don't want us to make an assumption about what the UDAs are unless there's a little bit of a conversation about whether or not you really want mixed use in the EO of Anderson Corner. And if you do, then you take the next step and you run that in the model with all those implications. And then the same thing is true for Eastern State. If you make that a mixed use and you add 3,000 more people on there, I'm sorry, it's going to impact what's already congested. So you got to have that conversation before you go out and ask somebody, do you want to expand? And the same thing is for Croker. So when you take a look at that Croker interchange, on the north side of that thing, around the golf course, 2 of the large plots there are in the conservation easement, and we're not going to put a mixed use in those areas. So we ought to be looking at the assumption of those UDAs and whether or not they're going to expand or not before we go asking people, do you want to do this?
Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead, Ellen.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say again, we'll definitely be looking at specific areas at the land use meetings coming up in December. But that's helpful feedback regarding the potential questions that you all are interested in asking the public. Thank you.
Jack?
Yes, just a couple of things. First of all, it just occurred to me as I was listening to the consultant's presentation, does it make sense to have this discussion on transportation before we have the land use discussion? Can we make sensible transportation suggestions when we don't know how the land use designations are going to work and where the PSA is going to be redrawn and so forth. That's point number one. Point number two, I'd like to just read a brief passage from the present comprehensive plan, the 2000 comprehensive plan. And this is from page 37. And James City County, quote, can be characterized as suburban in nature, given the lack of an urban core. The increased demand for housing is influenced by those wanting to be residents of James City County, but commuting elsewhere for employment. Generally, the wages and jobs in surrounding localities are higher than the wages available from employers inside the county, and the housing units available for those working in the county at lower wages are limited, close quote. I would like to answer the question, and I think residents of James City County would like to answer the question, do we want to be a suburb of another jurisdiction? There's no such goal in the comprehensive plan. There's never been one, and yet here we are. And if the answer to that question is yes, that connotes a whole new approach to land use planning and transportation planning and community character and environment and everything. Basically, you can rewrite the whole comprehensive plan. If the answer to that question is no, we have a lot of work to do in terms of land, the whole litany. The other thing regarding UDAs and whether they should be mixed use or something else, I have, as I think you all know, I don't think some of these areas should be UDAs at all. Anderson Corner should not be a UDA, whether you call it a mixed use or economic opportunity or anything else. That's not a suitable place for a high density area, whatever you want to call it. And I certainly agree with Frank. The Eastern State Hospital grounds are also not suitable. It would be a traffic nightmare and an environmental nightmare. The Powhatan Stream, the creek that runs through Newtown, is already fouled. Would just make it worse. A lot of different issues on that. Finally, a point I made during the Workforce Housing Task Force report is a lot of these UDAs, they're in Williamsburg, and they're also in James City County, are built right on the exit ramp of either 199 or I-64. And they're just primed for commuting longer distances. We're widening I-64. There's a suggestion that we want to widen parts of 199. And you build Newtown right on a cloverleaf. You want to build mixed use developments right on exit 227 of I-64, which I actually am in favor of. Williamsburg is building the quarter path development, a huge residential development right on the entrance ramp for 199 and I-64, 6 brand new beautiful lanes all the way into Hampton, and Newport News, and it's all automobile dependent, and it's all designed specifically to promote longer term commuting. Is that what we want? I didn't hear anything from our community outreach that suggested that it is what we want, but it's clearly where we're headed, and it's clearly designed that way. This didn't happen by accident. And so do we want to continue in that direction? So first off, do we want to be a suburb of Newport News? And coming here soon when they widen the road in the other direction, do we want to be a suburb of Richmond? And then you get into the whole thing of the new working from home model, that how durable is that after the pandemic goes away? Will that promote more people, moving out from the cities into the suburbs? So there it is. Those are all my questions, but
Thank you, Jack. And I didn't know, does staff want to address that? Or there's also two other folks in the queue, Tim and Jenny, with questions or comments. So Ellen, did you want to address Jack's comments, or do you want to get everybody's out there at one time?
Yeah, maybe we could see what other comments the commissioners have.
Okay. We'll go to Mr. O'Connor and then Ms. Workman. So Tim, you're on. You're muted also.
Sorry. I actually have a question for Jack, if he'd be kind enough. I don't understand, or just curious why Jack doesn't feel Anderson's Corner is a good place to have higher density.
Sure. I have some notes on it. I'll see if I can dredge up here, Tim, if you bear with me 1 second. But basically, you have it at 227. You have it at, there's a mixed use at Tuano. And I'll give you the actual, okay, here. The close proximity of Anderson's Corner to two mixed-use areas of I-64 exit, 227, which is 3 miles, and 231, which is 4.1 miles, and Tuano, which is 1.9 miles. I just don't, for one thing, I don't see the need because of that. You have 3 other ones right there. Secondly, it's rural. It's part of the rural character. I know it's inside the PSA, but it's part of the rural character. It is the Historic Triangles transportation study shows an almost doubling of traffic through that part of Richmond Road by 2040, which would make a mess of Tuano and make a mess of that whole stretch of road, frankly. From the comprehensive plan, mixed-use development should create vibrant urban environments according to development standards of the comprehensive plan, page 186. Anderson's Corner, on the other hand, is, quote, one of the few remaining areas in the PSA with significant rural agricultural vistas and contains one of the few remaining rural historic structures in the county of the Whitehall Tavern. Future development should maintain an appropriate historic setting for the Whitehall Tavern and preserve the rural and historic character of the area, close quote. So those two don't mix. The definition of mixed-use developments, now this could be something other than mixed use, I guess, and still be a UDA, but so all of that, traffic, the close proximity of 3 other mixed-use settings, and just it's not part of the intended character of that area, in my opinion.
I appreciate it. Thanks for clarifying. And then, so the only other comments that I have sort of out of this in response to what Jack put out there, I don't think the suggestion is that we become a suburban type place. I do think, and I've been operating under the premise that part of the scenario B planning is that, the goal is to attract some sort of, to create an environment where we are attractive to some sort of business entity to relocate here and provide those higher end jobs. So folks are more inclined to live and work here, and currently if you're heading west on Route 60 at Anderson's Corner, that's designated EO, and I think what we probably need to look at is whether or not our current EO model is correct. Because if we're looking at higher density and having that opportunity to create the higher density sort of mixed use model, you know, capping the residency does, in my opinion, two things. One, it limits affordable housing, and two, prevents us from having that higher density to make these types of environments successful. So those are my comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. Ginny?
Thanks, Rich. One of my questions, I'm new to UDAs, so pardon my naivete here. I read in the memo that the UDAs would be re-examined every 5 years as part of the comprehensive plan, but I couldn't see anything in what we were doing where I understood the process of how we would, or how the designation of UDAs would change. Who does that? How do we do it? And in that connection, I thought about the comments that I've heard previously about ending the extension of Moortown Road, for example, and how that might play into the Croker interchange. The comment that was made earlier about whether we ought to be doing land use first kind of resonates with me. And in that connection, I also thought about, and maybe this is just making things too complicated, but I also thought about John McGlennon's comment about, could we have other population scenarios that go with, that would then generate different traffic patterns, different density places where we might want to think about changing. And so I'm just asking a whole lot of questions, I guess, that I don't know the answers to, and I'm hoping to get some help here.
Good. Thank you, Jenny. And then, you know, all of these questions will be addressed as soon as everyone gets a chance to voice them. Next was Dr. Rose. Rob?
Yeah, thank you. Could you go back a couple slides to your 4 steps of the model? Yeah, this one. Yeah, so my questions are a little interrelated, and they relate to other modes of transportation besides automobile. And I'm curious, I guess, here in step 3, how do you know what the mode choice is beyond cars? Because cars, it's easy, you put that strip out, you can see how many cars are traveling across a road at any one time. And the bigger question, and the second question that I have is, it seems like a lot of these models are really based on going from point A to point B. But when it comes to both walking and biking, that's not always the case, and oftentimes isn't the case. Sometimes you just want to go out and ride your bike or go out and go for a walk. And I would say that, I'm curious how that's accounted for. And then in thinking of new bike lanes, how does that play into the model in terms of where they might go and what decisions are made, in part to address this desire to have more bike lanes?
Good question.
Okay, so I waded into that just a little bit when we started talking about UDAs, and, you know, did I believe that the model would be sensitive to those? And so I stated, and it's a limitation in what we have to work with, is the model we're working with is based on the regional HRTPO model. And the HRTPO model, in fact, does not explicitly represent pedestrian and bicycle traffic. So, you know, with respect to looking at decreasing or the effects of UDAs decreasing demand on roadways and on transit or on buses, and that people would choose to walk or choose to bike, the model's capable of saying something about, well, the average trip lengths are shortening and folks aren't getting onto the roadways or getting onto the buses to do what they want to do. But your other comment, it's a very astute comment, that, you know, the nature of active transportation, biking and walking, isn't necessarily going from point A to point B. And that is just something this travel model cannot estimate, quite frankly.
Just to follow up, I want to invoke something that we got sent about this law of induced demand. I think Jack had sent that out in a paper that he shared with us. It's really encouraging to see that, because I can imagine that more bike lanes mean more people riding their bikes by that law of induced demand. So it's something to keep in mind. And I just also want to suggest, as a cyclist, that not all bike lanes are equal. And I want to make sure that our goal isn't just blanket, we add X miles of bike lane, because it's not as meaningful as we add X miles of bike lane that are actually usable. And there's a big difference between a bike lane and a usable bike lane. So I hope it's something that we can keep in mind as this progresses forward.
Thanks, Rob. Jack, did you have an additional comment? And you're muted there.
Yeah, sorry. Just a couple of things. I had a response to one of Tim's points, and I've forgotten it. I'm sorry. I like Rob's comment about the law of induced demand's effect on bicycle lanes. This is just anecdotal, but there's no question that the Capitol Trail has brought a very, very large increase in bicycle use to James City County, not just James City County residents, but people who come in from other areas. And I think it's had some positive financial impact. So I think Rob's right on target with that. And I'm sorry, I forgot my other point. I lost it. So.
Well, if it returns, give a shout.
Yeah, I'll call you about 3 o'clock in the morning.
Ellen or the consultant team, did you want to address the comments?
Hey, Richard, I just got it again.
Go for it. Yes.
Yeah, and this is this can apply to Anderson's Corner or just about any kind of a UDA. The purpose of a UDA, as I understand it, is to compact development into a relatively small area, and with a number of different activities: residential, commercial, entertainment, shopping, all right there. Like Newtown. Newtown, I think, is a very good mixed-use project, or a UDA. It has all of that stuff right there. Nice movie theater, restaurants, office space, commercial areas, residential, and so forth, all right there. The problem is we didn't stop there. We create these UDAs and we add sprawl all around it. And that defeats the whole purpose of a UDA. And so if you're going to have a UDA, say, in Toronto, and a UDA on exit 227, and then you fill in all the space in between with residential sprawl development and commercial areas and office buildings and everything else, then you've defeated the purpose of having a UDA in the first place, in my opinion. So anyway, that was the point I was trying to make.
Thank you. Ellen and the consultant team, do you care to address those issues, please?
I'd be glad to jump in. Going back to Ms. Wortman's comment about relooking at the UDAs, I think you all are rightly pointing out and grappling with the real strong connection between transportation and land use. And all of our UDAs are designated mixed use, and I think there's going to be a natural progression from relooking at some of the land uses and you all making some decisions coming up over the next few months, and then relooking at the UDA designations as part of that. So I think that would be how that would flow. I know that's a little bit vague at the moment, but we'll get some more details for you coming up. And I think in general, many of the comments that you all are expressing today are something that we can come back to, having had a chance to look and discuss a little bit more some of the land use aspects. So that may not have addressed all the, I guess there was a question about population assumptions, and I think I would guess that the consultants would mention that we can probably adjust those types of assumptions within the leave behind model as well. And maybe as just a quick, perhaps final comment there. I don't know if Bill or Vlad, you would want to comment on that.
I had this is Vlad, a brief follow-up. Yeah, and also on the UDAs, I think Ms. Wertman also asked who creates those and when are they updated. They are a designation that the state created that improves your potential for getting funding and improves your applicability for smart scale funding, but they don't guarantee funding. But they are totally locally adopted and changed. State has no say in that. And then on the modeling, yeah, to Ellen's point, the purpose of the overall scenario planning and the travel demand model in the scenario planning was to test this overall countywide concept and see what the results would be from a countywide standpoint. So the land use plan was almost a diagram. Yes, it had to allocate specific population employment to specific areas and things like Eastern State Hospital, but the purpose of it was to get a countywide impression of what's the total delay versus the trend scenario. And now, of course, the challenge is digging into that, as Ellen mentioned, on a parcel by parcel or more specific land use basis. And then when that is done and gotten to where the Planning Commission and everyone, is comfortable with it, then it can be put back into the travel demand model. But first, it has to be built into the land use model, then put into the travel demand model, and then that can be the basis for the leave behind model. It's not a quick process to be able to model a land use change, because you got to build it into the countywide land use model and then do the countywide travel demand model to see the impact of any one particular development or any one roadway or interchange. But that is the process for it. And I hope that helps.
Thanks, Vlad. Any other comments or questions before we move on to the next chapter? All right, so taking it from Ellen, there will be a return to some of these issues that were brought up during this discussion, which I thought was a very good one on everybody's part. And so based on that, Ellen, did you want to say anything preface to the environmental?
Just to say thank you and turn it over to the Environment Chapter team, Tori Haynes and Brett Meadows.
Thank you.
Yes, and thank you again. This is Tori Haynes again, and I'm here with my colleague Brett Meadows, and we'll be presenting chapters or draft materials from the Environment Chapter. Also joining us today are Tony Small from Stormwater and Resource Protection, and Danny Poe and Mike Ushock from JCSA. And I did want to mention that we received your comments on this chapter over the weekend, and we're working through those items for you. Next slide. Today, we'll look at some highlights from the technical report, then move into a summary of community guidance received to date. We'll also touch base on the watershed zoning briefing paper and the existing GSAs from the current comp plan. Next slide. Before we jump into the technical report highlights, I just wanted to briefly mention some organizational updates that apply to this chapter since the last comp plan adoption, just in case you're flipping through the current chapter and noticing some different terms and department references, mostly for our newer members. In 2016, development management was renamed to community development, and at that time, the department housed engineering and resource protection, or ERP, and they oversaw things like development plan review, bonding, and related items. We also had a stormwater division under general services, and they dealt more with county-owned stormwater facilities and programs. And in 2017, those two divisions were merged into stormwater and resource protection under general services, so that all of those related tasks and programs could be administered under the same division. Next slide. Now I'll jump into some technical report highlights, and I just wanted to mention here and acknowledge that this chapter covers a broad range of topics, each of which could probably fill their own presentation. So just keep in mind that these highlights are very brief summaries of some of the key topics covered in the technical report. Next slide. This is a glimpse of some facts and figures for James City County, and we'll touch on some of these a little later. Next slide. The county has roughly 152 miles of shoreline, 17 of which are located in the York River watershed. The rest is in the James River watershed. Various organizations and agencies, such as VIMS and the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission, help monitor the conditions of our shorelines and provide coastal resource management assistance to the county. One known ongoing issue is shoreline erosion, which typically ranges from 0 to 2 feet per year. Erosion tends to be especially prevalent along the James River near Jamestown Island. There are a variety of methods to address shoreline erosion. Living shorelines in particular are the favored method because they take more natural approaches using native plant species installations to protect shorelines, rather than structural methods such as seawalls and bulkheads. As of this year, Virginia now requires living shorelines as the preferred method for stabilization, whereas before they were simply recommended. The county is in the process of implementing the living shoreline approach at Chickahominy Riverfront Park and the James City County Marina currently. Next slide. Moving on to water quality, and in this case, we're generally talking about surface water quality. Various natural and man-made actions can impact water quality, such as erosion, agricultural waste, pesticides, and petroleum-based substances. Over 130 pollutants are monitored, and waters not meeting certain standards are considered impaired. We work with DEQ to help track and improve impaired waters. For impaired waters, DEQ sets a total maximum daily load, or TMDL, and pollutants must be reduced to that TMDL amount. The table in the technical report reflects the most recent TMDL data. Next slide. Here we'll touch on state and county water quality regulations, and this is just a very simplified, brief summary of some of the key items that are implemented here in the county. The Erosion and Sediment Control Ordinance, it's the first half of Chapter 8 of the County Code, regulates control measures implemented during land disturbance and construction to reduce erosion, keep loose sediment from leaving sites. The Virginia Stormwater Management Program is the second half of Chapter 8 and oversees regulations for water quality and quantity, BMP design, and other items related to stormwater runoff. The VIPTES permit is issued for stormwater discharges from construction activities. The MS4 permit is issued to localities who operate a storm sewer system and discharge stormwater into local waterways, and James City County is an MS4 locality. And the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Ordinance regulates development and other activities within the resource protection and resource management areas to protect sensitive habitats and local waterways. And any areas in James City County that are outside the RPA are considered RMA. Next slide. Related to water quality and stormwater runoff is impervious cover. This is basically any non-porous surface that doesn't allow water to infiltrate naturally. So rainfall is converted into stormwater runoff, which if left unmitigated can erode stream channels, carry pollutants to waterways, and contribute to local flooding. We often think of roads, sidewalks, and buildings as impervious surfaces, but gravel surfaces and compacted dirt can also be considered impervious. The Chesapeake Bay Ordinance requires 60% max impervious per site, or treated to equivalent quality. Next slide. Sanitary sewer overflows are the unintended discharge of wastewater from the sanitary sewer system into the waterways, typically during storm events. So if it rains really hard and the system can't handle it, the wastewater can discharge back out into waterways. In 2007, HRSD and regional localities were placed under a consent order by DEQ to reduce wet weather-related SSOs. This required extensive study, repair, and improvement of the wastewater systems. HRSD has proposed a plan to fund and implement rehabilitation and capacity enhancement on a regional basis, and this plan is currently being reviewed by DEQ and the EPA. In the meantime, JCSA has been completing upgrades and repairs to the local system to enhance capacity and reduce SSOs. Next slide. There are 14 watersheds in James City County. 6 have county-adopted watershed management plans to date, the oldest of which are the Powhatan Creek and Yarmouth Creek plans. The current versions of those plans were adopted in 2006. As noted in the watershed zoning briefing paper, funding was recently requested to update these plans, but they are temporarily on hold during the coronavirus pandemic. Proposed new watershed management plans include Diaskin Creek, Skiffs Creek, and College Creek. Also of note is the Lower Chickahominy Watershed Study. This is a 5-year study funded by the Virginia Coastal Zone Management Program and facilitated by Plan RBA. The Lower Chickahominy is recognized as one of the most pristine freshwater wetlands in the Mid-Atlantic, and this study will cover James City, Charles City, and New Kent counties with a dual goal of natural resource conservation and economic development. Next slide. Some common agricultural impacts on water quality include animal waste, pesticides, and erosion. The county's Chesapeake Bay Preservation Ordinance offers some regulations such as buffer requirements and pollution reduction standards. Agricultural operations can implement best management practices such as cover crops and rotation practices, conservation tillage, structural erosion control measures, nutrient management planning, and soil and water conservation plans. Agricultural practices can't always be regulated, but in some instances, implementation of ag BMPs can be incentivized by things like cost share programs with the help of organizations like the Colonial Soil and Water Conservation District. This is a separate political subdivision of the state, and its jurisdiction covers James City County, as well as York, Charles City, New Kent, and the city of Williamsburg. It's not a regulatory body, but does assist localities and citizens within its jurisdiction on soil and water quality issues. Next slide. Moving on to groundwater, we are currently reliant on groundwater resources for drinking water, but must evaluate alternative water options due to changes to our withdrawal permit from DEQ. Some typical impacts to groundwater sources include landfills, pesticides, underground storage tanks, and wells. The latter two can be particularly impactful to the water supply because older tanks, especially from older tanks and wells that were not built to today's standards, it may be old enough that we're not even aware of their existence. The county and JCSA conduct well and groundwater data collection, groundwater level tracking, wellhead protection, and implement design standards for BMPs and storage tanks. Next slide. The floodplain ordinance regulates activities within the flood zones and complements the building code's enhanced standards for structures located in flood hazard areas. Updates to the flood insurance rate maps and floodplain ordinance were adopted in 2015, with additional updates adopted in 2018. The county takes a proactive approach to protecting the community against flood risks by participating in the National Flood Insurance Program's community rating system. These efforts have led to increasingly positive ratings, and the county was recently upgraded from a Class 7 to a Class 5, which allows for a 25% discount on flood insurance policies to all residents. Next slide. Tackling climate change and sea level rise is very much a regional effort while also requiring attention, local attention here in the county. At the state level, the 2018 Virginia Energy Plan helps guide policy throughout the state. One of the goals stated in the plan was to join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, and that work has been ongoing at the state level for the past several years. And just this year, we successfully joined RGGI, becoming the first Southern state to do so. Locally in the county, we seek ongoing efforts, or we have ongoing efforts to improve energy efficiency in our buildings and in our fleet. We have a green buildings incentive policy, as well as other incentives, such as density bonus points and the zoning ordinance for development projects. We also participate in a regional sea level rise planning effort through HRPDC, who provides program assistance and data to Hampton Roads localities. We're also anticipating a new study from VIMS focusing on future road inundation risks based on projected sea level rise. We're particularly interested in this study because not only will it show where flooding events occur, it will also take into account the duration of annual impact. So this means we'll have a better idea of which roads will be impacted for short durations versus roads that could be impassable for a substantial amount of time each year. Next slide. Some recent county projects that have been completed include the James Terrace water quality improvements, Cooley Road stream restoration, and grant awards for the Chickahominy Riverfront Park shoreline stabilization and Grice's Run stream restoration. Next slide. Now I'll move into community guidance highlights. Next slide. Through the survey and first round of public engagement, one of the public engagement themes most directly related to this chapter is protect the natural environment. In the 2019 Citizen Survey, over 95% ranked it very important or somewhat important to improve the natural environment. During the Engage 2045 Summit on the Future, residents indicated support for a broad array of sustainability, resilience, and environmental stewardship measures. The second and third rounds of community engagement are ongoing, and the results will be incorporated into the chapter materials as soon as they're available. Next slide. And next we'll discuss the watershed zoning briefing paper. Next slide. This paper provided some background on the county's existing regulations along with some existing watershed management plans and how they're implemented. It provides considerations for sub-watershed impervious cover limits, development of regulations, and interaction with planning and legal considerations. It also provides concepts that could be explored as an alternative or complementary approaches, should regulatory approaches not be permitted by the state or otherwise not pursued. Next slide. With all this in mind, staff is seeking feedback from the PCWG on next steps. Is it the PCWG's guidance to move forward with exploring the approach of regulating impervious cover limitations by sub-watershed? If that's not the preferred approach, would it be the PCWG's guidance to explore any other potential approaches listed in the briefing paper? In relation to the question above, is it the PCWG's guidance that additional information on this topic be included in the environment chapter? That any specific actions on this topic be included in the GSAs, or that any language encouraging further study of this topic be included in the GSAs? Is there any additional information that would be key to your ability to provide guidance on this issue? And is there any desire to ask citizens for input on this issue? Next slide. And finally, we'll discuss the GSAs. Next slide. As with other chapters reviewed so far, staff has not revised the GSAs at this point. We're currently examining potential revisions and have tentatively identified some areas for updates. Members of the PCWG are welcome to provide initial suggestions and comments. Next slide. And now we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Tori. And could you go back a couple slides to what you had as far as the questions for the working group? Keep going. Yeah, that one. And I saw Frank had his hand up. Mr. Polster, you're on.
First off, Tori, Tony, thank you very, very much for the paper that you did. And as you know, and I think commissioners know, I do not think that pursuing the watershed-based zoning is a productive use of the capacity of the staff, given what you have in place and what may be possible in the future. So from my point of view, as the guy that raised this issue, is I would not want you to do and spend any more staff time on it.
Okay.
I do have a couple other comments.
Okay, go ahead.
Having said that, I didn't include this in any of my notes, Tori, but it came to me that when you take a look at the technical report and you look at the section that looks at farmland, forest land, and ecosystems, is that we kind of center that chapter on the land elements as opposed to the services. And what I was hoping that you may consider is taking the DCR definition of eco-services, which is wildlife and plant habitat, biodiversity conservation, water resource protection, which Tony does perfectly, erosion control, sediment retention, which he does also, protection from storm and flooding, which I think you've seen my comments on that. But the two new things are crop pollination and carbon sequestration. And those two elements, I believe, from a GSA point of view and on two papers that I've submitted, is that we look at a zoning policy in the rural areas on the use of pollinators for solar farms. And then the second paper was the carbon sequestration piece, which would benefit the AFD for a longer term in terms of putting that in the conservation easement for 20 years as opposed to the only 5 or in some cases 10. So I think if you broaden that section, then you open yourself up to be able to look at least a couple additions for those two GSAs of carbon sequestration and then the pollinator solar farm piece in the rural areas for it. The other piece that comment I wanted to make is that when Tony looks at all of the regulatory policies that she has, one of the things that she has is the MS4, and that responsibility is only 5% of the total land in the county. The rest of the responsibility is what the HOAs have in their 800 plus VMPs, but the majority of those responsibilities end up revolving upon the Colonial Soil and Water District. And so I applaud you, Tony, for getting the Colonial Soil and Water District guys to look at shoreline in those rural areas of the county. And if there is some way that we can sharpen the GSAs to recognize those contributions that they provide to the county, I think that would be a benefit to everybody, as well as a very positive way to tell citizens about what you're doing to reduce that gap in terms of protecting the environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Jack, you had your hand up next. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me skip to Tony Small because I think she wants to address some of Frank's comments. Go ahead, Tony.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to respond before I forgot all your comments. Frank, thank you. Thank you very much for all your comments. Ironically, we just had a call the other day with the Colonial Soil and Water Conservation District to drill down and discuss a little bit more their proposal for the shorelines. And I know that they're going to be presenting that this week at the board and at the Chesapeake Bay Board meetings this week. So there's more presentations to come. But you raised some interesting points, and yeah, we appreciate your support and definitely something I'm interested in looking into further. It's just a matter of trying to fit that into the wheelhouse. So.
Good. Thank you. Jack?
Yes. Hi. Thanks, Rich. the draft of the environmental section of the comp plan, which you included here, Tori, first of all, is very well done, I think. But I'd like to make develop a theme that I've included in the economic development and in the community character sections, and it also applies to environment, and that is the link between the environment, community character, rural and historic ambiance, open spaces, nice vistas, and so forth on our economy. It's not just a tree hugging issue; it's an economic issue, and I can quote. I promise I won't, but I can get you a dozen quotes from various county publications: the Business Climate Task Force report, the Workforce Housing Task Force report, the existing comprehensive plan, the housing condition study. All of them link our environment and our historic and rural quality of life to our economy. And by the way, I agree with that, even though I didn't write them all. James City County has very little to offer in the way of distinction in the marketplace for economic development. You know, we have a convoluted transportation system here, being on a peninsula. You can't go north and south. Our nearest airport is in sharp decline. We have no natural resources to speak of. There's very little reason to come here other than a very nice, attractive quality of life. And I would like to weave that into the introductory statement on the environmental section. And very specific, you write in the first paragraph, while the continued investment in the community can be heralded as a measure of economic vitality, efforts must be made to mitigate the impacts of growth. Impacts, if left unmitigated, could lead to decreased water quality, increased soil erosion and stormwater runoff, loss of scenic vistas, agricultural lands and historic sites, destruction of wildlife habitats, deforestation, and air pollution. And I would just add to that, all of which I agree with, by the way, but I would just add to that, and economic decline.
Yeah, good. That's a good point.
The other, and I'd like to follow that with a question, if I may, Mr. Chairman. The discussion further down, I'm not sure I could find it right now, on the bulkheads and riprap and so forth, and how they can have a negative impact on erosion and how it's much better to have living shorelines and so forth. Can we have an ordinance restricting the use of bulkheads and that sort of thing, or is that not something the state allows us to do? And if they did allow us to do it, would that be a good idea?
Turn that over to staff for a response on that one.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Haldeman. So earlier this year, as mentioned, it's in the text and was mentioned briefly in the presentation, the state did pass legislation that requires living shorelines over structural measures unless there's sort of a case-by-case consideration.
Shame on me, I missed that, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Tony might be able to fill in a little bit more on that, but basically that overall state requirement, and it trickles down to the localities. And so James City County did adopt that formally, the reference to that requirement just this July.
Great.
Thank you. And Tony Small has a comment.
Yes, I just wanted to add on to what Tori said. Yes, thank you, Tori. Jeff Madden with BMRC recently spoke at one of our Wetlands Board meetings to update the board on the recent change in the legislation. And he basically indicated that in order to be consistent with the new law, you need to ask why a living shoreline cannot be incorporated into that project. So it's pretty restrictive in that, you have to prove that you can't have a living shoreline in order to get out of, doing it. So it's a big change from just having guidance to having legislation requiring that. And even though they're still coming out with the guidance and it's being published right now, our board, the County Wetlands Board, has been directed to consider that for each case moving forward. So I hope that provides some additional information for you.
Thank you. And Frank?
Yeah, Tony, yes, I get that it's the wetland board piece, but you saw in some of the stuff that I gave to Tori is we already know which areas of the county, and I'm not talking about the VIM stuff, I'm talking about the HRPDC, I'm talking about other work, that we already know which of the areas in the county are going to be impacted. And so one of the things that I was trying to suggest and why I applauded you in terms of your partnership with the Colonial Soil and Water District is that maybe we need to look at a son of the neighborhood drainage program where the county participates in those areas it's responsible for in the same way that the Colonial Soil and Water District is going to look at their jurisdictions, where we can provide some assistance, technical assistance, to help people make those decisions so that when they show up at the Wetlands Board, it isn't the Wetlands Board trying to sort out what's going on. Does that make sense, Tony?
Yes, it does. And that was a discussion that occurred at that meeting as well, is that, you know, there are some limitations on the available. I mean, we only have 2 staff at the county, and they do a lot more than just wetlands permits. So we are always stretched very thin on that part, as well as the only technical support right now in the state that we have, based on my understanding from Mr. Madden, is, you know, VIMS, when they're available, you know, staff from VIMS, and then the DCRCs, which is the Shoreline Erosion Advisory Service. You know, but they're centered in Richmond. I don't believe they have a large staff. So we're very limited in getting that technical support to folks in James City County and how frequently that's available. So having another resource like the district who would be more local and accessible and available would definitely be a positive, I think, for the county.
I think I understand the capacity issue, but the thing is that you're already investing in engineering drawings and studies. So what you're doing out at Chickahominy could just as well apply to Governor's Landing and Jack's concern, as well as what you did on the restoration on Jamestown Beach for it. So there's some different ways of approaching this that, because of sea level rise and because of the increase in flooding, this problem is going to get worse. And so just like we took $0.015 to put against the SMART projects to build Skiff's Creek, maybe it's time for us to look at the same thing that gave you $0.01 to be able to do what you're doing in stormwater program that was dedicated to your program. So I'm just suggesting is that I understand the limitation your capacity, but it doesn't mean that county citizens wouldn't want to invest in that, just like they would invest in a PDR program or other programs that help to preserve the environment. And so please consider that notion and what is that capacity level that you require, just like we did in the strategic plan 3 years ago for transportation and for stormwater. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Some good comments. And I just, my 2 cents is I very much am in agreement with Frank's papers that he submitted earlier, as well as the comments that he made tonight, and Jack's suggestion for the wording change. I very strongly agree with the idea of looking at including information and possibly goals and strategies on carbon sequestration, about pollinators being mandated for solar farms, and maybe in other areas of the county, maybe even around BMPs or other features. But I think those are all excellent points, and I appreciate Tony Small's comments as well in these efforts. It was very enlightening. Anybody else on the working group have any questions or comments? Tori and Ellen, did you get what you needed from our discussions?
Yes, I think that was very helpful.
Okay, good. In that case, then, we can move on to the facilities chapter materials.
Yes, thank you. The public facilities team here tonight is Terry Costello and Jose Ribeiro.
Good evening, Terry and Jose.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight we'll be presenting the public facilities section of the comp plan. Also with us today is Doug Powell with James City Service Authority in case you have any questions. Next slide. This is our agenda for this evening. Most of today's presentation is based on information that can be found in the technical report. The technical report is the proposed revised chapter text of this section. We will then briefly present information regarding community guidance and goals, strategies, and actions. There are also 2 additional documents that were included in the packet. One was concerning water supply planning, and the other was information on scenario modeling. Next slide. Public facilities are required to support the services and functions provided by the county and its associated public and private agencies. Public facilities are divided in 5 major categories: public education, public safety, public health, general county government, and public utilities. Next slide. New and renovated facilities should be cost-effective, have functional and operational efficiency, be energy efficient, follow green building design standards, complement existing facilities, and serve the long-term needs of the county. Since the last update of the comp plan, the Board of Supervisors adopted a strategic plan. The strategic plan is the county's guidebook for future investment, provision of public services and facilities, and the county's work plans for the next 20 years. 2 of the priorities of the strategic plan are to modernize infrastructure, facilities, and technology systems and provide exceptional public services. By modernizing infrastructure and facilities, the county improves the quality of life for residents and addresses the changing needs of the population. The county provides exceptional service by improving services to its changing populations. Next slide. Division and departments within the county are continually assessing the facility and service needs of the community based on changing demographics and growth trends. Departments use level of service guidelines to assist in this process. These guidelines help direct development and operation of public facilities. These guidelines provide thresholds for measuring the impacts of growth with respect to creating new facilities, seek to maintain and improve the quality of service delivery to the public, provide a practical way for citizens to balance performance with fiscal limitations, and they are a statement of the expectations that residents have for their government services. Next slide. The facilities and service guidelines that are developed are unique to James City County. Each county department and agency affected was asked for input. These guidelines are developed to achieve the following goals. Quantity and quality of facilities will be maintained in relation to the population demographics, characteristics of the population, as well as size and demand. Public facilities remain an expression of what citizens need, desire, and are willing to support. They should be located in close proximity to the greatest possible number of people and are provided proportionately to the number of people served. New facilities or expansions are located where most needed or required. Local community objectives and activities are supported by encouraging the full utilization of all public facilities, including joint and multi-use facilities for use by different county agencies, the development of shared facilities, and the development of public-private partnerships. Next slide. For all measures of performance, the effective capacity should be used. This is usually less the design capacity, and it is the capacity achievable given the design and available resources. For new school sites, factors such as proximity to neighborhoods located within the PSA, availability of land, ability to minimize transportation costs, and accommodation of multiple users are important. Also, the square foot per student standard for the different levels should be considered to ensure efficient and appropriate use and size of design space. The space guidelines listed on the slide reflect the standards used in constructing the most recent school sites and include space allowances for recreational considerations. The Williamsburg Library consists of the Williamsburg Library, the James City County Library, the Stryker Center, and the mobile library services. The facility and service standards are also listed on the slide. Next slide. Facility and service guidelines are noted on the slide shown. Examples for fire protection are response times of 6 minutes or less, and to provide a fire station in areas where there are 365 or more calls per year. For law enforcement, it is to provide a field office in all future fire stations, maintain an average response time of 7 minutes for high priority calls, and maintain a clearance rate of for crimes that exceed the national average for similar localities. The standards for corrections are based on populations and beds and standards from the Board of Corrections. Next slide. For refuge collection and disposal, the county has a transfer station and 3 convenience centers. The county provides residential curbside recycling services. Refuge collection is handled through private companies. Standards include to provide all county facilities with appropriate recycling receptacles and provide residential curbside recycling services at a reasonable cost. Partnerships within this category include Old Town Medical and Dental Center, regional funding for the Peninsula Health District, and Colonial Behavioral Health and the Heritage Humane Society. The general county government category consists of the office and maintenance buildings that house county departments. The county sponsored a space needs analysis to examine facility needs of the county's various administrative functions. This analysis can be used to develop a facility master planning study, as well as assisting in examining alternative concepts of renovation, expansions, and/or new construction to meet the county's needs for space. Next slide.
JCSA, like any other public water supplier, must obtain a permit for the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality to withdraw groundwater. DEQ has concerns about the long-term viability of the aquifers, and it is their intent to reduce the amount of groundwater withdrawn. Because of this concern, JCSA must identify viable long-term water supplies and look for ways to reduce the county's demand for water. This is also a goal in the strategic plan. All water and sewer facilities shall be consistent with the 4 documents listed on the slide: JCSA regulations governing utility service, the design and acceptance criteria for water and sewer systems, standards and specifications for pump stations, and the HRSD regional construction standards. Next, please. The Commonwealth of Virginia encourages localities to consider opportunities to provide broadband access that can meet current and future needs of its citizens and businesses. Children in households with broadband access have more educational opportunities and in obtaining career success. This access is also important to the local economy. It is also important to realize that there are logistic and financial challenges. The Center for Innovative Technology has a toolkit which includes mapping of coverage based on best available data in Virginia localities. The maps from the center appear to show broad coverage with some gaps, primarily in the rural west and northern portions of the county. Most broadband service is provided by private companies, but local governments can provide support by encouraging private providers to extend or improve service, by pursuing grants, funds to assist in the cost of infrastructure, and by monitoring new technologies and updating regulations pertaining to wireless communication facilities in the zoning ordinance as appropriate. Next slide, please. The Space Needs Study completed in 2020 examined the facility needs for county administration, Williamsburg-James City County School Board and Central Office, and the courthouse functions. The study developed metrics to determine the amount of space needed by job function, evaluate utilization of existing space, identify deficiencies, and apply metrics and best practices to achieve a baseline assessment of space needs. And as shown on the current slide, the current square footage for each category is listed, along with the square footage that will be needed by 2040. Next slide, please. The next two slides summarizes the public input most directly related to the public facilities chapter that has been received so far. This first slide shows the responses from 2019 citizen survey. Through the survey and the first round of public engagement, one of the themes that most directly relates to this chapter is respondents desire additional quality of life, amenities including parks, public water access, expanded recreational facilities, trails for walking and bicycling, transit connections, and other enhancements to existing public facilities. Next, please. As a follow-up to the survey, the county hosted the Engage 2045 Summit on the Future to engage with citizens to determine their vision for the future of the county. Respondents were asked to indicate their biggest concern for the future, for the county's future, and 11.5% answered that the future water supply of the county was their biggest concern, while managing growth was the most frequent response to a separate question of what is most important to accomplish. Ensuring the county can manage the quality of public services was the second. Three responses included the county should secure its own affordable water sources. Libraries should continue to expand with branches where people reside. The county should meet the technology needs for the 21st century, and the county must plan for schools that accommodate a growing population. Next slide, please. For this initial review, the goals, strategies, and actions adopted as part of the Toward 2035 Leading the Way comprehensive plan have not been revised. The staff is exploring potential revisions, and members of the Planning Commission Working Group are welcome to comment on GSA revision and to provide suggestions for questions to include in the next round of public input. Next slide, please. So this concludes our review of the Public Facilities Technical Report, Community Guidance, and Goals, Strategies, and Actions, and we look forward to your questions and your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jose. Mr. Polster, Frank has a comment.
First off, I want to compliment the staff for the connection between this chapter of the comprehensive plan and the strategic plan, which I've written about. And I really think that that kind of a tight connection tells our citizens, whatever the gap may be in this area, is what we're going to do to try to fix that. So I compliment you all, and I hope that you consider applying that same thing to other areas, other chapters. The second comment is that if I did a word search for future water source within the current public facilities or comprehensive plan that we have, I wouldn't find anything. And it's the number one item in the strategic plan, an alternative water source. And I appreciate the paper that laid out where we are right now. But I do think that we ought to have language associated with that for the simple reason that I've always thought that maybe not having more water is another solution to not having growth in the county. Anyhow, that issue and where we're headed on that ought to be contained in this chapter. The third thing is that you talked about the social services pieces and and those building facilities. As I recall, in the legislation that was passed 2 years ago, and there's a comment in the current board discussions that's coming up, asking for how they're going to accommodate that consolidation on the eastern state property. And so when we start to look at the land use issues associated with that, I certainly want to understand what piece of that property will be accrued to the county for the consolidation of the social services facilities for it. The last piece is kind of an interesting one, and it ties the land use model and the idea of how many schools, how many firehouses, how many police people that we saw in the comment. When you look at the levels of service, as an example, the level of service for the fire station says that it's a response time of 6 minutes, but it's also generates 365 emergency incident calls coverage. So how does the model know about those 365 calls? So when they told us that we needed a new firehouse, and they told us that we needed it either in the north, central, or southern areas, how did they compute the levels of services that we have for schools, fire, and police coverage into their model? I don't know, but I certainly would like to understand how that model is generating additional public facilities based on our levels of service. Thank you.
Because that was a very specific question, I'm going to hold off going to Ginny for a minute and ask if staff or consultant could specifically address that question about the model and the need for the facilities and so on.
I believe we have Julie Herlins on the call. I know she was on earlier. Would you mind speaking to that, what the model takes into account for public facilities?
Sure, yeah. And I just wasn't sure you all knew that I was on. So can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Okay, great. Yeah, this is Julie Herlins. I'm with Tischler Bice. We're the lead consultant on the fiscal impact analysis portion of the study, and developing a model both to evaluate the plan prior to adoption, and also the leave behind model. So the question regarding how calls for service, in particular for public safety components, and in this case, the fire station, how that's taken into account. And so what we've done in terms of our approach on the modeling is to divvy the county up into our sub areas, which have been reported back to you all in past meetings, as I understand it, and projected future potential calls for service based on averages, based on current levels of activity today, assuming those continue by type of land use, driven from different types of land uses. And so as those calls are then projected based on new growth in each of those sub areas, and the capacity for existing stations, what existing stations serve those areas. Once you hit that capacity, much like a school seat being filled, the suite seats being filled, it's analogous on the fire station side, that once that capacity is filled, a need for an additional fire station is triggered. And so the starting point really is current levels of service. The distance component, the drive time, that element, that's really where the foundation for fire services planning starts. And then we kind of pick up with where they're at today, given how those stations have been sited thus far and the needs for the future needs. So our approach really then becomes, we're starting from their planning standpoint with the distance component, and then using as a quantitative feature the calls aspect to then trigger the needs for additional facilities.
Good. Thank you very much.
That was very helpful. And it goes back to my initial comments when we were talking about the transportation section. And what will determine that is what those population densities are based on the land use pieces.
Correct.
And so I hope when we get to that piece where we start getting at the parcel level of detail and then reconciling whatever that population element is going to be, that we can then adjust the model that you have based on that data, hopefully.
Good. Thank you, Frank. Ginny?
Yeah, just a brief question that's right in this, focused in this same discussion area, which is for the planning needs, space needs analysis that was conducted in 2020. And I'm assuming, well, let me ask it this way. What population assumptions did you use, and how do those relate to the population assumptions that are in the models that the comprehensive plan has been using?
Good. Terry or Jose, can you, or one of the consultants, can you address that?
May I ask Ms. Wertman, were you wondering what assumptions the space needs study made about population, or that the model made about population?
Actually, both. I was thinking specifically of the space needs with the, because clearly that has to have some population assumption in it. But if you could answer the question with regard to both, that would be helpful, and how both relate to the models that the comprehensive plan has been using.
Well, the model would use the overall framework that made assumptions. The land use component then went into transportation and into the public facilities analysis. So that was all consistently using that one. I can't remember the exact number, but it was the PDC projection for 2045. And it's my understanding that the space needs analysis used the same set of assumptions, but that I'm a little less familiar. So if others wanted to jump in, I'd be glad for assistance there.
I believe it did, Ellen, but I can double check just to make sure.
Thank you, Terry.
Okay, thanks.
Tim O'Connor.
Thanks. It's more of a commentary than a question, but since we talk about public facilities and offering up services, I'd mentioned this once before, but I think it's really important that when we talk about public facilities to include schools, that we really need to consider what kind of programs the schools are offering. And I understand it falls to the purview of the school system, but you know, I think as the parent of high school age kids, you know, for us to take advantage of either any vocational training or governor's school, you know, you got to send your kids off on a bus early in the morning and send them down to Newport News or Hampton. And I just don't think that makes for a quality education and a really strong school system. So I would like us to, as we talk about education and facilities, whether it's in this section or another, I think we should talk about the actual service that the schools are providing.
Thank you, Tim. Any other, Frank, did you have another comment, or is your hand just up from last go around? Okay.
I'm sorry, just up from the last one. I just took it down. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? I'll turn to staff. Ellen, any additional feedback you all need, or are we good at this point?
I believe we're good, unless the chapter team folks have anything they needed.
Terry, Jose.
I think we're good.
Okay. Good.
Yeah, I think we're good too.
Good. Thank you very much. And thank you to Doug Powell for giving his availability, his time availability to us for this discussion. I appreciate that, Doug.
Thanks.
That concludes the chapter materials. Are there any other items for discussion from working group members? Seeing no one, I will then ask for a motion for us to adjourn to November 23rd PC working group meeting at 4 p.m.
So moved.
Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right, we're adjourned. Thank you all. Good discussion.